Hello, my name's Justin Brierley and I'm recording a special set of video seminars for Spring Harvest at home because we can't be together in Skegness and Minehead and elsewhere. This is coming straight from my home, but I hope you enjoyed the content that I've got for you today. Going to be doing something a little different actually to what I originally envisaged doing at Spring Harvest, at least for today's seminar, because with the coronavirus pandemic I thought it would make a lot of sense to address the issue of suffering and evil, especially in light of this current crisis. So that's what I'm going to be looking at today. My talk is titled, Why Doesn't God Just Stop Coronavirus and Mend the World? A little bit of an introduction to me first of all though. I'm the host of the Unbelievable radio show and podcast. It's on every week on Premier Christian Radio on Saturdays, and you can find it as a podcast wherever you are in the world at any time of the day or week. Simply go to our website to find out more, premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. We also do an annual apologetics conference. Unfortunately, that's had to be postponed because of the coronavirus outbreak for this year, but we are hoping to reschedule it for next year, so look out for more details about that. And there's loads of other resources from the website. You can find an app, a newsletter, lots of videos and blogs, the YouTube channel, and of course my book, which is called Unbelievable: Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists I'm Still a Christian. It's really the story of my show, which brings together Christians and non-Christians for dialogue and debate, and why after over 10 years now of hosting those discussions, I still believe Christianity makes best sense of the world that we live in. So if you'd like to get hold of that, Unbelievable: Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists I'm Still a Christian, that's available wherever you get your books from, or indeed again via the Unbelievable website. Well, today's topic is a difficult one. The problem of suffering has been around since the year dot, really. In fact, one of the oldest books in the Bible, the book of Job, that's exactly what it deals with. So these are questions that have been around for a long time, and in a short talk I'm not going to be able to answer all of the many issues that are brought up by this question, but I do hope that some of what I have to say will be helpful along the way. You can boil it down to this question: if God is good and all-powerful, then why doesn't he just stop bad things from happening? And that in a sense is being asked by people all over the globe right now because of the coronavirus pandemic. It's hitting the West with full force. My social media timeline has been filled with responses to it. Many of those are practical. How can we be good citizens at a time like this and help each other out? Many of those are pastoral. How do we maintain community and relationships in this new age of social distancing? But many of the questions are theological too, and so I have a lot of Christians and skeptics who come on my social media timeline to talk about the things I'm posting. And the obvious question is, why is God allowing this? Now, I don't know if you remember, a few years ago now, Stephen Fry, the well-known TV personality, had an interview on an Irish TV channel that went viral, in which he railed against a God who would allow so much suffering and evil in the world. He was especially critical of a God who would allow disease and viruses and that kind of thing. He called him a mean, petty monster of a God who would allow this kind of thing. That was a really tough video to watch. I don't know if you saw the clip that circulated a lot a few years ago. It was one that I wanted to answer as well, and towards the end of this video I'm going to be including a video that I shot around the time his video came out. My answer to Stephen Fry, an open letter if you will to Stephen Fry, which I think will encapsulate some of the ideas that I'm going to be putting forward in this video. So stay around to the end to see that video that I made a few years ago in response. As I say, this question is one of the oldest questions ever asked. There are no easy answers, and to be honest, most often for those who are going through a time of pain and suffering, what they really need is our love and care in that moment, not necessarily our clever theology and philosophy. However, when the time does come for intellectual answers, I think there are some helpful ways to make sense of suffering. Now, there are many reasons why I believe it may make sense for God to allow us to go through a certain amount of suffering. After all, it's not actually God's job to keep us safe, secure and pain-free. God is concerned with bringing us into a relationship with him as fully human people, and that means we're often shaped by both the joys and challenges of life. I don't believe God causes suffering, but I do believe he can allow suffering to shape us as individuals. In fact, a lot of the suffering that happens in the world is actually down to us at the end of the day, isn't it? We use our free will in all kinds of ways that cause the world to go wrong. Wars, famine, a lot of these things are simply down to the way we have misused the free will that God gave us. And if the person says, well, why doesn't God simply override it when we decide to do things that go against goodness and sharing and hospitality and generousness? Well, the problem is that if God simply stepped in and waved a magic wand and stopped us ever doing anything bad, using our free will for evil purposes, then of course we would no longer have free will. We would be robots. We would have no sense in which we are actually doing the things ourselves. And the problem with that is that if God simply did that, we wouldn't have the capacity to do some of the things that are most valuable in human life. To love, for instance. You have to have free will to be able to give and to receive love. Otherwise, it's simply something which is mechanistic. And I don't believe God wants us to live in a purely mechanistic world in which we don't have free will. There are some, if you like, trade-offs that go on in that sense. The cost of the free will that God has given us is our ability to use it for wrong as well as for good. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't think we can lay the blame for all kinds of suffering and evil at God's door. A lot of the blame rests with us because of the way we've chosen to use our free will in the world we live in. And I believe that even so, God is able to use lots of the aspects and circumstances of life because he's wise and powerful and loving enough to use the pain often of our circumstances for some greater purpose. But that's not what I want to really focus on in today's talk, because really when it comes to something like the coronavirus, which is affecting all different parts of the world and doesn't appear to be, at least in many ways, something that any individual or individuals have responsibility for. It's not something we can simply put down to free will. That comes under the banner of what sometimes is called theologically natural evil. And that in a sense are those things like death and disease, natural disasters like earthquake. And we can ask, well, why has God allowed those kinds of things to exist in his world? Things that are outside of the control of humans, it would appear. And we may be able to understand, the existence of evil caused by our own free will. What about this natural evil that exists in the world? And I think that's a question that can only really be answered from our own worldview as Christians. And it means we have to sort of expand our perspective to a cosmic scale. Now in Romans, the Apostle Paul says, we know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. And the Christian story, in a sense, is that the whole of this created order is somehow out of kilter at a cosmic level. Some theologians trace this to human rebellion. It's an outworking of the fall, which acts both forwards and backwards in time. And another point to the existence of an earlier rebellion in the angelic realm that sparked a cosmic fall. That's hinted at in Revelation 12. But whatever the origin is, the result is that we live in a world that isn't as it should be. Yet Paul includes this promise as well, doesn't he, in Romans, that one day the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and the glory of the children of God. So everybody's experienced the tension of living in this broken world that's out of kilter. And the groaning of creation brings both good and bad across our paths. The natural laws that operate are both a blessing and a curse in our world, because tectonic plate activity, well, that refreshes the surface of the earth with the minerals that we need for life. Yet it can wreak havoc when we build on those fault lines. Or look at cell replication. That allows our bodies to grow and develop in the way they need to. But it can result in cancer when those natural processes misfire. And in some way, death is almost a necessary part of the cycle of life, yet still it remains what 1 Corinthians describes as our last enemy. So we're living in this sort of tension of the groaning of creation. And I think this is part of a bigger picture, a cosmic battle that's going on, because the coronavirus is just one more example of this broken world we live in. Life is a God-given miracle of extraordinary engineering and complexity. Yet the physical processes of life itself are subject to viruses and parasites and disease. It's that bondage to decay that St. Paul speaks of. It's sort of reverberating through the whole of the cosmos. Now, that cosmos that God has created is a world of free creatures, both physical, you and me, human beings, and the spiritual realm as well. And in that sense, God has granted a level of freedom to the whole of his created order. And that means that I don't believe God's going to simply step in and wave a magic wand every time there's suffering in the world. Rather, we are part of the problem of evil, and so God is going to use us as part of the solution as well. And throughout the New Testament, we're presented in this out-of-kilter cosmos that there's this war going on. There's this picture of spiritual warfare in which God has chosen us, his fellow people, to be fellow combatants against a war, not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual principalities and powers that are mentioned in Ephesians 6. And that happens through our prayer, our love, and our action. Now, here's an important thing. I think God hates coronavirus, okay? I don't think God has willed or made coronavirus in order to do something, test us in some way, but rather the fact that the creation kind of has been given this freedom means that in that out-of-kilter creation, things are going to happen, things that are not within God's will, but nevertheless, which God can use for his greater purposes. I've increasingly seen that this warfare view of reality may help those who've experienced great suffering to understand that God isn't the author of their pain. There was one person I interviewed for my radio show, Jessica Kelly. She lost her 4-year-old son Henry to brain cancer, and she talks about this story in her book Lord Willing ? Now, radio hosts are supposed to sort of keep it together on air, but I failed to hold back my own tears when she told me the story of her little boy's painful struggle and death, despite the prayers of the church community and the best efforts of doctors. Yet the thing is, Jessica says that her crisis wasn't compounded by a crisis of faith, which is what often happens when people think that God is sending them this stuff to test them somehow. Jessica had come to reject what she terms the blueprint view of a God who creates pain and suffering as part of his sovereign plan. Instead, she embraced what she calls the warfare view, that we live in a world where natural disasters, disease and evil are tied up not only with the choice of human beings, but by the freedom that's exercised by spiritual powers, forces in rebellion against God. And although the war was decisively turned towards victory through the death and resurrection of Jesus, there still remains a world full of these spiritual battles. That's why we pray, "Thy will be done on earth as in heaven." It's precisely because God doesn't always get his will on earth that we're praying that prayer. And I think Jessica found it helpful to know that the death of her 4-year-old to brain cancer wasn't God's will. Henry was a casualty, if you like, in the ongoing battle to redeem a fallen and broken world. And here's a quote from her. She says, "It was incredibly freeing to know when we saw beautiful things happen, when people were coming to the house with casseroles and gifts, we could say, this is from God. God is doing everything possible to maximize good. And when we saw our son suffer and the pain and death, I could say, this is not from God. That meant I could maintain a passionate faith in the midst of such a terrible loss." And I think Jessica's perspective can equally be turned to this present coronavirus pandemic. I don't believe God wills this crisis, so let's not lay the blame at his door, but he is working through the actions and prayers of those who are seeking to see his kingdom come on earth. Now, of course, Jessica's view, that warfare view, is controversial to some people. Many would object that a God who isn't in control of the whole show isn't the God of the Bible. Calvinist theologians, for instance, believe that God is the author of both joy and sorrow, and even though we may struggle to see it, he works through both for his ultimate purposes and glory. And they would see the warfare view maybe containing too much of the same sort of randomness in suffering that the atheist who doesn't believe any kind of purpose behind the universe has to contend with. But inevitably, different Christians are going to come to different conclusions as to how to reconcile God and the problem of suffering. But at least what we can agree on is that God is good, suffering is bad, but that God's love and purposes will win out in the end, however that happens. And the Christian story is of a broken and rebellious creation that's awaiting the renewal of all things. We're called to live faithfully for the kingdom that's already come in Jesus, while awaiting the kingdom that's yet to be, in which he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Well, there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away, as we're promised in Revelation 21. That's why I believe God is in the process of mending the world, and it's happening through us as well. I believe God's masterful enough to weave many of the experiences and tribulations of our life into a tapestry that's ultimately beautiful to behold. But you know what it's like when you see a tapestry. What you see as beautiful on one side, if you turn it over, there's just a mess of tangled threads, that you can't make any sense of. And I think that's often the way it is with us when we look at the world we're in and the things going on. We can't make sense of them from our perspective, from this side of the tapestry. But God is masterful enough and in his grace able to weave something beautiful that ultimately we'll be able to turn over and look at and say, God knew what he was doing. The same time, I want to avoid the cliche of simply palming off the reality of suffering as a kind of it'll be all right in the end sort of cliche, because simplistic apologetic explanation can do more harm than they do good, especially in insensitive hands. So there are many griefs and sorrows that we would all swap in a heartbeat if we could, Some things are just plain awful and it's hard to dress them up in any other way. And there are lots of questions we're never going to see answered this side of eternity. So there is a kind of a limit at the end of the day to what we can do with these explanations and what are sometimes called theodicies of the reasons why God may allow pain and suffering. And very often we'll come to an end of trying to explain things, and all we can do is throw ourselves on the mercy of God, weep with those who weep, and continue to stand up for truth and love wherever we can. What I would say for many people who are going through suffering, as I say, they don't necessarily need clever theology or apologetics. Maybe the one thing that will help them is to know that God knows what they are going through, because that's at the centre of the Christian story. The God who came to be with us as one of us and died an awful, brutal, humiliating death on the cross because he knows what it is to suffer. That can give us comfort, even though it doesn't necessarily give us an answer as to why there is suffering. It can be a great comfort to know that God knows what you're going through. He's been through it, and he's with you in it when you're going through it as well. So the good news is that whatever questions remain, we are called to trust in this God of the cross and of the resurrection, the one who turned the greatest injustice and defeat in the world, turned it into an ultimate triumph. So God, if you like, specialises in turning evil into good. And these are unprecedented times. Crises can bring out the best and the worst in people. Many people are going to be rediscovering what really matters to them. Many people are going to be looking for hope in the midst of despair. And that gives me hope that actually God is going to bring good out of this situation. We can't second guess ultimately what will come out of this, but I do believe in a God who turns the worst into the best, the God who turns death into life, who turns despair into hope. That's what the Easter story is all about. We worship a God who is in the business of doing that, a God who is in the business, as we speak, of mending a broken world, and he began that project with Jesus Christ. And so we're all called to join with God in seeing that redemption happen all around us, turning Good Friday into Easter Sunday. I said I would play that video response that I made to Stephen Fry. So I'm going to do that as I finish out today's video here on why doesn't God just stop the coronavirus and mend the world. I hope you've enjoyed the answer I've tried to give in the course of today's video. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, do email me unbelievable@premier.org.uk with your thoughts on this video, and do go and check out the podcast and the video channel as well. Just look up Unbelievable Justin Brierley wherever you get your podcasts or your videos from. You should find some stuff from us. In the meantime, I'll leave you with this final video of me answering Stephen Fry.
Dear Stephen, I, along with many others, have watched the video in which you explained what you would say to God if you met him. And you explained how, because of a world in which we live of suffering and injustice, you'd have to tell that God that he's a mean, stupid maniac of a God. Now, I'm a Christian, and my first reaction to that was to want to tell you, look, I'll give you 5 bulletproof reasons for why that's not the way God is. But then I kind of realised actually you're not really giving an argument against God, more an expression of your anger that the world is the way it is if a God is in charge of it. And so rather than give you some kind of a philosophical rebuttal, I thought I'd tell you a story. Now, we probably don't have that much in common, but one thing we probably do share is a mutual love of the literary genius of this man, Oscar Wilde. That's why we're filming here today on a cold winter's day at his memorial in central London. Now, I know that you share a deep connection with Oscar Wilde, but I have something in common with him too, and that is that he believed in the same God that I believe in. I've just been reading recently to my kids Oscar Wilde's stories for children. They're absolutely brilliant, and actually I think they're for adults as well. My favourite definitely is the story of the selfish giant. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I think Oscar Wilde in this story expresses actually the true nature of God. The story centres on a garden. It's a garden where it's always winter and never spring. Children used to play there, but they don't play there anymore, and it's all because of the giant's selfishness that has brought this down on this beautiful garden. Interestingly, the Christian story also begins with a garden. And however you interpret that story, fundamentally, it's about the idea that from the beginning, the world has gone wrong because of us. And in many ways, that's bent the whole world out of shape. So in a sense, we're living in the winter garden that Oscar Wilde describes. But in the story, after many years of it being winter and never spring in his garden, the giant sees a child at the end of the garden underneath a tree, and he has a change of heart, and he goes out and he lifts that child into the tree, and suddenly the tree blossoms, and suddenly winter is over, spring has arrived, the children come back, and even the giant's own heart is thawed because of it. But the child he so loves never reappears until the giant grows quite old, actually. And then, while it's winter again, and Wilde adds here, he didn't hate the winter now, for he knew that it was merely the spring asleep and that the flowers were resting. Well, he sees that child again at the end of the garden, underneath the same tree, but this time the tree is laden with gold and silver fruit. Well, Wilde takes up the story. Downstairs ran the giant in great joy, and out into the garden. He hastened across the grass and came near to the child, and when he came quite close, his face grew red with anger, and he said, "Who hath dared to wound thee?" For on the palms of the child's hands were the prints of 2 nails, and the prints of 2 nails were on the little feet. "Who hath dared to wound thee?" cried the giant. "Tell me, that I may take my big sword and slay him." "Nay," answered the child, "but these are the wounds of love." Oscar Wilde didn't believe that God was a tyrant who was basically out to make an evil world. Rather, in a world that's bent out of shape, where winter reigns and the blossoms are few and far between, he spoke of a God who comes into our world, into our darkness, and bears it with us. He talks about a cross and nails, nail prints in his hands and feet, and that these are the wounds of love. These are the defining characteristics of the God that he believes in. "Who art thou?" said the giant, and a strange awe fell on him, and he knelt before the little child. And the child smiled on the giant and said to him, "You let me play once in your garden. Today you shall come with me to my garden, which is paradise." And when the children ran in that afternoon, they found the giant lying dead under the tree, all covered with white blossoms. Now, I'm not saying that this gives a definitive answer to the problem of suffering and God. I think there are good reasons why God might allow suffering, but even if I could give you a brilliant explanation, that wouldn't be much good for the parent who has lost their child to bone cancer. But what might help them is to know that they're not alone in a universe where their fate is really on the roll of a dice and suffering is just a brute fact of our existence which has no ultimate answer. I think that for anyone who suffers, the idea that God himself would come in to our winter experience, bear our suffering with us and bring spring, well, that may be the only hope of making sense of any of the suffering that we all do experience in life. And I'd even dare to say that maybe a world in which that love can be expressed is the best kind of world that we can hope for. So, Stephen, I don't believe in your God standing guard at the pearly gates any more than you do. But I do believe in Oscar Wilde's God, a God who expresses himself as a child and who, on a tree, with nail prints in his hands and feet, brings in spring. That's a God worth believing in. Thanks for watching.